We'll go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, ooh golly, that didn't work. Hi, my name is Matt, and I have an addiction to rocketry. I don't regret it, and this video is about my attempt at the complex K impulse record. In 2022, I used the Aerotech H13 to set the single stage H impulse record with this rocket. Oh, actually, not this rocket, this rocket. I know what you're thinking, and yes, I did build it in a few hours. Don't ask. It ended up breaking the previous record, and somehow it still holds the H record at 15,257 feet. Please go out and break it. It's been begging to get broken since I made it. I want to try it again, but I want to wait for somebody else to break it first. Anyway, this made me take a look at the complex records. It turns out that the relatively new end-burning H motors make these records, or some of them, fairly low-hanging fruit. So last year, I decided to make a low-effort two-stage attempt using an H169 booster with a fin-slotted interstage design and an H14 sustainer. Here's how that went.
Oh, that's gonna lock out.
Don't like.
It didn't work. When you're using a cardboard booster with a 3D printed fin-slotted interstage, turns out things get real bendy. I recovered everything, but this pool noodle of a rocket wasn't it. After that, I took the opportunity to learn how to build a proper rocket and launched my Wildman Mach 2 up to 19,500 feet for my level 2 certification. In doing so, I learned how to make a good AFBAY, work with composites, and importantly, use a single break dual deploy recovery method that I use now regularly on my rockets. More on that later. With all of that context, let's get into the meat and potatoes of this project. This is a two-stage rocket that should reach about 35,000 feet and have a maximum velocity of about Mach 1.5, which happens under boost. I call the project Into the Unknown, which is a naming convention based off of one of my favorite TV series, Over the Garden Wall. The booster, called Greg, is powered by an Aerotech K700, and the sustainer, called Wirt, is powered by an Aerotech H14. The booster is a 54mm minimum diameter fiberglass rocket. It uses a featherweight for GPS tracking and an Elven beacon for backup RDF tracking. For recovery, it uses a Blue Raven as the primary flight computer and an Easy Mini for redundancy. It uses a single break dual deploy recovery method that employs the coupler as a chute cannon. I picked this method up from Kip de Gertis, and many people are curious about it, so let's go through it. When the apogee charge goes off, it is situated at the bottom of the recovery volume. It forces the upper half of the rocket out and the drogue along with it. There is one primary recovery line, and we can imagine it taut underneath the drogue just for the purposes of understanding how this works. The main chute is on its own harness that has slack to its attachment point on the primary recovery line. This means that even though the primary recovery line is in tension, there is no tugging on the main's harness. The main shouldn't come out unless, optimally, the black powder charge fires and the main comes out, or suboptimally, if it wiggles out during descent. One way we can mitigate this is by packing the chute such that it has a nice snug fit in the coupler, and that should be enough to prevent this from happening. When the rocket reaches its main deploy altitude, the chute cannon charge fires and the main comes out. Since the main parachute's harness is attached to the primary recovery line, there should be no real tugging on the airframe. It should just shift the load from one end of the line to the other. This is a very simple recovery method with few failure points, and it reduces the amount of coupler mates on the rocket when compared to conventional dual deploy. And this enhances stiffness, which is something that's very important for multi-stage rocketry. A key component to success with this method, like any other method, is testing, testing, testing. Coming back to the construction of the rocket, the fin can is 3D printed carbon fiber nylon with 2 vacuum bagged carbon fiber layups on top. Finally, the inner stage is pretty much a solid block of 3D printed carbon fiber nylon with a custom carbon fiber sleeve on the inside that interacts with the sustainer's body tube. It's plenty stiff and seems to work okay. Now for the sustainer. It's also a minimum diameter rocket, but this time it's 29 millimeters. It's definitely a lot more restrictive in space than the booster is, so instead of having 4 different computers for deployment and tracking, it has 1. It uses the Silicdyne Fluctus, which is a neat computer that does deployment, staging, and tracking, and pretty much anything else you can think of. Having one computer that does everything makes the AF bay much more clean and easy to build, but reduces much desired redundancy when it comes to deployment. Not having a backup deployment computer doesn't give me the warm fuzzies, but unfortunately is fairly necessary for this rocket. The motor is an H14 and is slid in from the front of the body tube. The body tube has a 3D printed tail cone that's epoxied in, which retains the motor from the aft end. The forward end is retained using a bulkhead that is screwed in using a method I learned from a Jim Jarvis presentation. It uses the head of a socket head screw to keep everything held in place without squishing or fatiguing the composite tube. An additional benefit of this method is that the head of the screw tends to sit fairly flush with the exterior of the tube, making it nice and streamlined. The bulkhead has threaded inserts, making it easy to screw and unscrew. This is actually how I fasten all of my bulkheads, AV bays, etc., with the exception of the inner stage coupler on the booster, which I fasten with button head screws for maximum stiffness along the longitudinal axis. The body tube is a Mach 1 rocketry fiberglass tube. The nose cone is a custom-made fiberglass nose cone using solar sleeve, and the brass tip was turned by a good friend of mine. It's so cool. It really ties the whole thing together, and I love it. Thank you, Brian. The fins are carbon fiber with 2 layers of 1K plain weave vacuum bagged carbon fiber layups. The aft end of the rocket has a couple of bare inches before the fins, which slides down into the inner stage coupler on the booster. Recovery is the same single brake dual deploy method, but this time it's drogeless. The recovery line is attached to the AV bay bulkhead and the forward retention bulkhead above the motor. Alright, finally, second stage ignition, my nemesis. Starting from the top of the rocket, the Fluctus has its ignition wire go down to a JST PH2 plug, and the other half of that plug goes down at the top of the motor where it's soldered to a copper tape that runs down the side of the motor. The igniter wires are soldered to squares of copper tape of its own, and the sticky side of that tape, yes it's conductive, gets stuck to the motor's copper tape just before launch. The launch was out at the Black Rock Desert in Nevada. Our local rocket club, URock, puts on a small launch there every year, usually a week or 2 after a very large and well-known launch course. It's something I look forward to every year, and this year was no exception. A team from New Mexico launched a Q motor to 120,000 feet, and it turns out that that was actually a test for an even bigger project. We also had a team come all the way from Australia to attempt a space shot. Unfortunately, this launch was cursed with second stage no lights, and their rocket was no exception. We actually only had a couple of 2 stages that had the second stage light. As I was doing photography for both of these large teams, I had to wait until both of them were done to launch my rocket. When they finished up, I went out to put my rocket on the rail. I followed a checklist I'd made and got it all ready to go. And nervously, I took a picture and headed back to the flight line.
Matt, you ready to go?
Ready as I'll ever be.
Okay, here we go. Going up in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm still showing continuity. Try it one more time here. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Alright fam, look, this happened 2 more times. It took 4 attempts to launch this rocket. I was gonna have that whole thing play out and explain what happened with each one, but it was a colossal waste of time. So instead, we're just gonna fast forward through all of it and go straight to the real launch. All right, here we go.
We'll go in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yes.
1740, 2,450, 3,010, 3,440, 3,770, 4,020, 4,190, 4,280. The boost was so good. Like, so good. Let's take a look at some of the data from the Sustainer's flight computer. Maximum velocity was about Mach 1.4-ish. And here's where we start to get sad. The angle at burnout was 3 degrees. It's so good. That was a good boost. Even more troublesome, the maximum angle during the entire up part of the Sustainer's flight was 12.3 degrees. Now, for the astute among you, you may have immediately noticed that this is an abnormal thing for a high-performance rocket. Most high-power rockets arc over the top, meaning that they hit 90 degrees at apogee and then fire their chute with a little bit of horizontal velocity. Boys, the Sustainer deployed its apogee charge at 12.3 degrees. It didn't have enough sideways velocity to even arc over. This boost was straight up. What a waste of a great boost. So what happened? Why didn't it light? Remember how we attached the igniter? We used the adhesive from the copper tape that the igniter is soldered to, right? How much does that tape and solder weigh? Well, it looks like approximately about 0.15 grams per side, including a bit of wire that would also be influenced by the acceleration of the boost. And how much does that weigh under boost? Closer to 4 grams. Now, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a guy. But it sure seems to me that this adhesive on the copper tape, sucks. It sucks a lot. It's terrible adhesive. And the contact patch for each lead is about 0.3 square centimeters. And also, it's quite difficult to get it to stick to the motor's copper tape in general. It's kind of hard to reach. And so what's holding it up during boost? You guessed it, nothing except for the adhesive. Now, is the 4 grams that it feels during boost enough to pull the leads loose? Well, check out this super sick graph from the Sustainer's flight computer. You can see right here that during the boost, the Sustainer loses continuity with its igniter. It comes back later, which tells me that the contact was present, but very bad. Here at 8 seconds, it tries to light, and the contact was presumably just not good enough to be able to send enough power through to light the igniter. So that's why it didn't light. How do we solve this? The simplest idea I can think of is to design and print a plastic washer that goes in between the aft retainer and the motor and all of the electronic parts. This way, the force of the boost is directed up through the tail cone, up through the washer, through the electronics, and into the motor. It makes a washer, electronics, and motor sandwich. This way, the force of the boost pushes the contacts together rather than pulling them apart. An alternative to this is to solder the igniter leads directly to the motor's copper tape, but this has implications of being difficult to transport without damaging the igniter. And furthermore, if the igniter becomes damaged in any way, that means I have to desolder it and solder on a new one, which is something that's a pain in the ass in the field. I'd like to avoid this if possible. But for now, I think the thrust washer is our best bet. Alright, well that's all of our problems solved. Next time... Oh, shoot, darn. Looks like we got some more issues to solve. Whoopsie daisies. I never did talk about recovery, did I? Okay, well, remember that one time earlier in the video when I talked about how the main can wiggle out during descent? Well, that happened with the booster. Luckily, it only happened at about 8,000 feet, so it only drifted a mile or so, but that's definitely something we should solve. Simply adding a chamfered restriction ring on the inside of the coupler should help on that side of things. So what about the sustainer? Well, I recovered the front half of it really well. Unfortunately, I recovered it about 5 miles away and without the back half of the rocket. The bulkhead side of the Kevlar line on the aft end was severed, meaning that the back half of the rocket got punted. And this led to the forward half going stable on the way down, which then prompted the Fluctus to do its failsafe of kicking out the main so that it doesn't get way too fast on the way down. And it did this at about 14,000 feet, while half of the rocket was missing, with a chute that's intentionally oversized just in case it has to land with a full motor. It took a very long time to get down, and it drifted quite a ways. Its descent rate the whole time was around like 15 feet per second, or about 3 meters per second. As for the back half of the rocket, a lovely individual at the launch ended up stumbling upon it about a mile away from the launch site, and I'm very grateful for that. This allowed us to gain some insight as to what happened so that we could diagnose these issues. So why did the back half of the rocket decide to divorce the forward half? I have some ideas, and let's talk about recovery volume. The parachute occupies most of the coupler in the sustainer, and after the parachute, the rest of the recovery volume is, well, very limited. So tight that the two 1.5 millimeter thick nylon shear pins holding the two halves together struggle to do so. There's very little room for the ejection charge and Kevlar line, and everything is extremely compressed inside the recovery volume. When the tube is kindly returned to me, its side of the Kevlar line was broken, and I suspect a few things. Firstly, the recovery charge was directed at the bulkhead, where the bulkhead's Kevlar line attaches to. I wouldn't be surprised if the charge just destroyed that thin Kevlar by itself. Another thing is that the charge was pretty saucy. When I tested it, I wrote down that 1/4 gram was sufficient, but hot. I live by the motto, blow it up or blow it out, so a bit of a hot charge was acceptable to me. And then, finally, the recovery line wasn't very long, and there weren't any shock absorbers such as tape loops in the line. All of that momentum from this very spicy separation charge and the separation event went directly into the Kevlar line without ever being mitigated in any way. And I think one or any number of these things could have caused the back half of the rocket to separate. I did ground testing, but you can't do ground testing at 15,000 feet. Some things you have to learn the hard way. So what are the changes for the next flight? All right, well, first thing with the booster is to add that parachute retention step ring in the coupler. And hopefully that mitigates the issues of the main just wiggling out during descent. For the sustainer, we're going to add a couple of inches to the body tube. So that means we're going to have to rebuild the entire body tube section, including the fins. This time, we're going to do it out of carbon fiber. I'm going to make my own body tube out of Solar carbon fiber sleeve, and I'm going to make a video on how to go about doing that. I'm also going to make the fins out of plate that I've laid up myself, and then we're going to bag the fins, and I'll make a video on how to do that as well. So we're adding an inch or so for the recovery volume so that we can make the Kevlar line a bit longer and add some tape loops to absorb some of that energy from the separation event. But we're also adding another inch to install a camera. I figure if we're going to 35,000 feet, we ought to have a camera on board. And as it turns out, the mass and drag penalty coming from the camera and the extra 2 inches of tube are offset by the fact that we can make the fins smaller now because the center of gravity has just moved forward a bunch. I put some estimated numbers into the simulator, and it turns out that the performance hit is actually pretty negligible, and even if it wasn't, I'm happy to lose a little bit of performance for some good camera footage. So we're going to go ahead and do that. We're also going to procure a plastic thrust washer to keep the electronics compressed on the bottom of the motor and in good contact, or we'll just simply solder the igniter leads. I still got to figure that out. And then finally, that igniter fiasco was a mess. I felt terrible for holding up the entire launch over and over and then ending up just burning igniters anyway. Yeah, so that's the part that I skipped. I tried to launch the rocket 3 times before it actually launched, and 2 of those were bad igniters. So yeah. So we're going to start making better igniters. I have a few different methods that I'm looking at, but we'll address that in a future video. In the next video, we'll be making the new sustainer body tube out of carbon fiber sleeve and the fins out of carbon fiber plate. I'd also like to make a video on vacuum bagged composite layups, and we'll see if the next video has enough time to cover that, or if they need to be two separate videos. I'm not really sure. This is the first real video I've made, and I feel like it's bold to be planning anything in general. But anyway, subscribe if you'd like to see some composite work, and hopefully a record-breaking launch in a few months. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time. Let's get this thing to work.